In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at what makes blues chord progressions so unique. We'll dive into the harmony behind the most common type of blues progression to understand how it's constructed. And from there, we'll go over the things you need to know to play better blues solos, improvise more freely, and play things more deeply connected to the chord changes. My name is Jack Ruch. Welcome to my channel. Let's get into it. So to get started, we need to understand what exactly is happening in a blues. What are the relationships between these chords? Now today we're going to be going over a dominant blues, which is based around dominant seventh chords. So in the key of G, that would be a G7 chord for the 1 chord, a C7 for the 4 chord, and a D7 for the 5 chord. Now, the first thing to understand is that this is not a diatonic chord progression. These 3 chords do not fit neatly within one key center. If I was to play a 1-4-5 chord progression in the key of G major, the chords would actually be G major 7 for the 1 chord, C major 7 for the 4 chord, and D dominant 7 for the 5 chord. But that's not what we're dealing with here. So in order to really play over these chord changes, we need to address each chord individually, right? That's going to allow us to really play inside the changes and really make the most out of this type of chord progression. So now I'm going to play a solo example over a G blues. And instead of thinking about just one scale to play over the entire chord progression, I'm going to demonstrate how I would approach addressing each chord individually to really outline the changes. So to play this way, there's sort of an order of importance to the things you're going to need to learn. And first and foremost is your chord shapes, right? This is a great visual guide to see the notes on the fretboard that you're going to want to target in your solos. And it's way easier to visually see a chord shape than an intricate scale pattern, right? I can look at the fretboard and I can see these different chord shapes, and that can be a guide to everything else I want to play in that position, whether it's an arpeggio or a scale, right? So now I'm going to play over this blues progression, and I'm just going to use different chord voicings for these dominant chords over each chord in the progression and move through them. This is something you're really going to want to have down cold, because this is going to be a key to really seeing the chord tones around the fretboard when we get into outlining these chord changes in our solos. Next up is knowing your chord tones. You have to know the arpeggio shapes that fit these different chord voicings, right? This is going to give you the important notes that make up these chords we're playing over, right? The root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh, right? This alone really can allow you to play very nice melodic solos over these changes. And I've done a few lessons on this channel going into detail about this. But now I'm going to play over our blues progression again, and I'm just going to limit myself to only chord tones found in these arpeggio shapes, right? So for each chord, I'm only going to be playing the root, third, fifth, or seventh of that chord. And you'll hear how this really fits inside the chords, because literally the notes that I'm playing are the notes that make up this chord progression. All right, so finally in our order of importance comes scales. Now, a lot of players tend to paint over the changes to a blues with just one scale, whether it's the minor pentatonic scale or the blues scale. But as I said before, there's not really one scale that fits all of these chord changes perfectly. And to just kind of paint over it with one scale is not really giving each chord the attention and respect that it deserves. But there is a place for playing scales in the blues, and really it comes down to playing the scale that fits over each chord. And this can be particularly effective when you want to tie together your chord tones for each chord. So in order to do this, basically we're going to use these dominant or mixolydian scales over each chord. So for G7, we would play a G mixolydian scale or a G7 scale. Over C, we would play a C7 scale. And over D, we would use a D7 scale. Right, and this is going to give us kind of the full picture of every little note we can use to connect together these chord tones. And obviously there's a lot more we can use too when we get into chromatic stuff, and then more advanced jazz scales like the altered scale and half whole diminished scales and stuff. But for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to keep it simple and just stick to these dominant scales. And so, you know, going through this order, to me, it's really important to focus on the arpeggios and chord tones before you get into the scales, because that's really giving you the key notes that are going to outline the chords, and those are the notes you really want to lean heavily on and target in your solos. One of the problems with taking the scale approach is that you tend to kind of get lost in these shapes and not really think about how each interval that you're playing fits against the underlying chord. So once you've got the arpeggios down and you're able to hear and play things like the third, the seventh over each chord, then you can get into these scales to find other notes that can help you fluidly kind of connect these chord tones together. So now I'll play one last time over our blues progression using these dominant seventh scales to connect together some of these chord tone ideas. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Hopefully this gives you some new things to practice, to take into your blues soloing. As always, I want to thank you guys for watching the channel. Thank you for your continued support. Be sure to subscribe, leave comments, everything down in the comment section, and check out the description section to this video for all my different courses that I have out. The Patreon page, all that stuff is super helpful for supporting this channel and allowing me to continue to do these videos. So until next time, happy practicing, and I'll see you later.